Dear all, most welcome to this workshop that the Atlantic Council Northern Europe office in Stockholm is organizing together with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Nordic office, also in Stockholm. My name is Anna Wislander and I'm a director for Northern Europe and also heading the Stockholm office since 4 years back. And this will be our third collaborative workshop this year on the theme of European leadership. How is it going? How is it evolving? And how does it relate to transatlantic relations? In May, we explored the immediate effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in June, we focused on the geopolitical consequences for security in Northern Europe. Now, in December, time has come to take stock, given two major events. First, the ongoing revolution in Belarus, and secondly, US presidential elections. Both of them have occurred while Germany has held the EU chairmanship, and we also wanted to have that as a starting point for the discussions today. While we will come back to the situation in Belarus in our second panel, we are kicking this workshop off by focusing on the transatlantic agenda. Already way before the elections, US President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in her State of the Union speech, called for a restart regarding the transatlantic relations. And since then, there has been a range of initiatives from the EU and from European capitals. Rarely have we seen such a forward-leaning and proactive European stance to transatlantic affairs. On December 2nd, the European Commission and the High Representative put forward a proposal for a new agenda for global change, calling the victory of President-elect Joe Biden a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And the following week, last week, European Council identified a range of areas for joint cooperation, the global response to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, tackling climate change, enhancing economic recovery, cooperation on digital and technical matters, strengthening mutual trade, addressing trade disputes, reforming the WTO, promoting multilateralism, as well as peace and security. So indeed, a very wide and broad agenda. And what it is, I think, mostly is a clear signal that with the election of Joe Biden as the 46th American president, this is a chance to get things back on track across the Atlantic. Joe Biden has promised to come back to Europe, as he said at the Munich Security Conference in 2019. But how well prepared is Europe to assume this task? And how well prepared is the US? What is needed on both sides of the Atlantic regarding leadership in order to succeed? Those things, I think, we have to have at the core of this discussion, and moving beyond the topic agenda into what actions we actually can see first and also in the long term in order to move forward. I wonder, is Europe united enough in how we view the US? We have seen German Defense Minister here, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, having a dispute with French President Macron on the role of the US and how to view the US role in Europe. Can Germany play a role as a unifier, not only in Europe, but also across the Atlantic? Well, so many quite complex things to discuss, and I'm very happy that we have gathered this high-level group, both of speakers and audience, with us today to tackle this issue. I will have the speakers doing about 5 to 7 minutes of introductory remarks. And then I want this to be as interactive as possible. So for those of you listening now, please prepare to feed in your questions or thoughts either through the chat but also very well on camera. And then you can just tell me so that you would like to pose a question on camera, and we will have you broadcast it at this. As you understand, we are in a studio here, so we are broadcasting this now to be sent later on. So we are kind of on the record, but not immediately on the record, but for later use, but so that you know. So let me go to present the panel. We have Dr. Stephen Everts, who is Senior Advisor to High Representative Josep Borrell at the EEAS. We have Dr. Claudia Major, Head of Research Division, International Security Division at the German Institute for International Security Affairs in Berlin. We have with me in the studio Julius Liljeström, Head of the Department for European Security Policy at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs here in Stockholm. And with us across the Atlantic, my dear colleague Damon Wilson, who is Executive Vice President at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. So this is wonderful that you all have made time to come with us, and with us also a distinguished group following us as we start discussing this. I would like to start in Brussels then with Stephen Everts, and I wonder, Stephen, the EU, as I said, has been forward-leaning, but also, it could say, a bit divided. A range of initiatives coming from the Commission High Representative and the Council have discussed it, but they're not always referring to each other here. So there's also been some questions on how united are the EU institutions on the transatlantic agenda. So please give us your thoughts and suggestions for the way ahead here. Stephen.
Super, Anna and colleagues. Very happy to join you for yet another discussion on how to revive transatlantic relations. It's really, I think, quite striking that so many organizations, including yours, are grappling with this question of, well, I'd say, basically to translate the very positive mood that we now have into concrete action, into a concrete agenda, and then getting to work. And I think that's exactly the right framing, and also as you put it in terms of sort of the exam questions that the panelists will have to grapple. So how well prepared are we, and what can we do in concrete ways? And I'll try to frame some comments in that manner. I think one of the first things to say is your framing is right, because I do see, and others have pointed out this as well, that there is a risk that if we don't rapidly demonstrate our collective capacity to translate this positive mood in concrete things, then other things will crowd into the agenda. That's the nature of bureaucracies and political systems, that they have so many things that they have to do, and everybody in this discussion also knows about all the forces of inertia, the domestic polarization, the absence of a majority in the Senate likely for the Biden administration, the enormous range of issues that the administration will have to deal with, that there is this risk that if we blink and we don't grab this moment, if we don't seize this moment, that it'll be the time of the midterms again, and in a way the moment will have passed. And I think politics is a lot about timing, and there is something in the air right now that we really have to seize upon. So this is the question: how do you do that? And I think there's a phrase that was used around the U.S. election that I think should inspire us a little bit. And that phrase was, "the system worked." Everybody knows that before the elections and around the time of the election was a enormous amount of pressure on the U.S. political system because of this polarization, because of the acute hyper-partisan dynamics that were at play. And yet, the system did work in the United States. Record numbers, people turned out to vote. Even the court cases that the sitting president wanted to pursue were addressed within the system. And yesterday, the system delivered an outcome in terms of the Electoral College confirming Biden as the next president. And I would like to use this phrase, the system worked, also a little bit in Brussels terms, because you asked, how does it look in Brussels? Well, the system has been working very hard, precisely because there is this deep recognition that this is a particular moment that we need to seize. So, the Commission and the High Representative and the External Action Service, immediately got to work to write this agenda and use this once-in-a-generation opportunity to come forward with not only a hand that is outstretched, not only a desire to restart and revive the transatlantic relationship, but also to come with offers. And I think that's the philosophy that I think you should have in mind when you look at this document that you refer to, the 2nd of December joint communication. It's a political signal, but also an offer. We have things to offer as Europe, and this relationship can only revive if we approach it in that light. And I must say, I mean, this was immediately also backed by member states in the Foreign Affairs Council and subsequently at the level of European leaders. So the system in Brussels doesn't always work. I'm not going to pretend that everything is, I'm not a Pollyanna. I think you know me a bit. It doesn't always work. But in this case, the system worked as it should be. I mean, the center was producing proposals, closely working with the Germans as the presidency, shooting it to the member states, and it landed well because, of course, it had been tested with member states, and I think it was endorsed enthusiastically, and also this philosophy thing of offers as well as demands and expectations. Now, the agenda in the substantive terms, I think, writes itself, and you've referred to them on the pandemic, on the recovery, on climate change, on technology. I think there's a big theme on writing the rules of technology together, and so on. Now, quickly, if you allow me, something on what you refer to, the controversy between AKK and President Macron. Should we go transatlantic? Should we go European? Strategic autonomy or not? I think also that, frankly speaking, that debate has also been had in think tanks, but I think most policymakers agree that these are flip sides of the same coin. And that, yes, the role of the United States in European security is absolutely uncontested and essential. But yes, also Europe, and we've been saying this for decades, frankly, needs to shoulder a greater share of the security responsibilities, particularly in the European neighborhood. And that takes you to the whole agenda of capabilities, of operational engagement. I think we'll have chance to talk about that probably a little bit later. But I detect that there's people we've had the debate, we had another iteration of it, but now people are ready to to go into the concrete areas of support for Ukraine or Belarus or what have you. Second point, and I'll go very quickly, as far as the High Representative Borrell, and he fleshed out some of these ideas also in a policy article in Foreign Policy. Again, I can be brief, is the whole China question. Was prominent also in the joint communication. Everybody knows China's rise also brings challenges that we need to discuss between the United States and Europe. 5G, 6G, asymmetric market access, intellectual property, a raft of things. And I think in Brussels, people increasingly see this, as they do it in capitals, as one leg of our overall engagement in and with the Asia Pacific, but the other one is also strengthening ties with like-minded democratic parts of Asia. And the term Indo-Pacific is gaining increased currency here, and I think you'll see and hear more about that in the years to come. So those are the two legs, if you like, more robust vis-a-vis China, but also broadening it, having a more politically rounded strategy with the Indo-Pacific. Finally, on Iran, this is very, very important to us. Also as EU, and I will not hide from you, also as High Representative, because we play a particular role. The deal is on its last legs. It's under tremendous pressure for all sorts of reasons that I think people are familiar with. But now again, we need to move rapidly to find that pathway, and it will be a very narrow path, enabling the US to come back into the agreement while Iran comes back into full compliance. And then also opening the door to a further building on of the deal, in which we can address some of the wider concerns around Iran's regional behavior and other aspects. But that will also entail from our side a willingness to probably go beyond the economic incentives that Iran had been expecting to receive but didn't under the JCPOA. And all of this will have to be done very, very rapidly. There are also Iranian elections coming up and what have you. So this is an important priority. Last point, and I'll stop there. In all of this, I think it's important that we see this not only as reviving the transatlantic relationship of old, but that from the beginning we see this as mobilizing democratic countries, democracies around the world to work together on important issues. And perhaps the word the West doesn't have the same resonance as it has in this conversation that we have this afternoon. I spent quite a bit of my time in Asia, and I think we have lots of partners in Asia, but the word the West doesn't animate them, resonate with them in the same way as it does here. But I think it's very important that as we revive the US-European relationship, that we do this in a way that allows others to come with us. Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India, and others, and that our framing of the issues and our terminology facilitates that. I'll stop here. Thanks very much. Looking forward to the comments from the colleagues.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that was an excellent start, actually, and also an expose of various issues that I'm sure we will come back to several speakers. I would like to pick up what you started with, the sense of urgency, that something is in the air now, moving. And Claudia, I wanted to ask you, you have been a bit provocative too, calling for less talk, more action in your latest op-ed together with Christian Mölling, talking about the toxic terminology of strategic autonomy and how we need to move beyond that. So what do you want to see, Claudia, and how do you assess the movement so far?
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Stephen, for your comments. I think that's a nice start to have just a brief word on this, in my opinion, really, really unhelpful Franco-German debate on strategic autonomy or European sovereignty or whatever you want to call it. I think what annoys me so much is that if you look into the details of the various concept or even the various speeches the French president and the German defense minister gave, it's a faux débat. It's not really a big difference. If you look in the details what they have been saying, they all agree that Europe should not be bullied around, that Europe should have the ambition to be a rule taker and not only a rule maker. And they both agree that Europe has to do more to be able to defend what it has built. So then one might wonder, why do you spend so much time on discussing an issue in rather, shall I say, committed terms, if you largely agree? And this is actually what annoyed me in the debate, because sometimes one could have the impression that discussing terminology is the easy way out from implementation. And looking particularly in the area of security and defense, unfortunately, I tend to think that at least since Saint-Malo and Helsinki, Europe has an unlucky record of implementation when it comes to security and defense. And I think that was a starting point of my op-ed to say, fine, you can carry on discussing, but it would be really, really interesting and nice if you would start implementation at some point. I wanted to make three points, and the first Stephen very nicely already covered, so I can be very brief. The first one, how is Europe doing in the moment? And you perfectly outlined the moment and all what has been done. I would just add a little comment that I consider the German presidency also a kind of test case where the Europeans would return to Europe. What do I mean with that? Is that in the first half of 2020, the first reaction in the COVID crisis of many European countries was an inward-looking, domestic-focused approach. And they rather quickly figured out that that was not the wisest decision to take, and there was a kind of return to Europe. But I consider the German presidency more or less a test case whether this timid, modest return to Europe would actually really take place. And now, almost at the end of the German presidency, I think a bit more optimistic to say that this pandemic might have served more as a catalyst for more European cooperation and maybe enabled for a decision like the recovery fund that would have been unthinkable before. So to put that in a positive spin, a very difficult EU presidency, totally taken over by the pandemic, the whole program changed. But in the end, there was this positive momentum to bring the European spin back and overcome a little bit this inward-looking domestic focus, closing borders and all stuff, which we have seen in the spring. So this worked pretty well. Also already outlined on the Transatlantic Stephen worked pretty well. But now that's my second point. When it comes to implementation, particularly in the area I work in, security and defense, member states come in. And this is usually where it's getting difficult. So I call my second point transatlantic honeymoon and European divorce, or transatlantic divorce and European honeymoon, or none of those. I think that's very much up to what we Europeans are going to do. So we're entering 2021 as a kind of first 6 months, which are going to be highly interesting, or I would even say highly entertaining. We have two main challenges. The first is keeping European unity. Never easy, as we all know. And we have the second challenge, which is rebuilding transatlantic relations. Also quite a challenge. And if possible, not one at the expense of the other, which I think will be the main theme in the next months. Let me take the case of my country, Germany. Germany is, in the current debates, usually considered being the next go-to partner for the US administration. So the country probably where the US administration is going to turn to if it wants to talk to Europe in many areas. Germany is facing elections in autumn 2021. So that also means that the transatlantic honeymoon falls in our German election campaign. And as most of you know, election campaigns are never moments, or are rarely moments, for fact-based rational debates. So the question, what I'm wondering is how we are going to marry those challenges, keeping the European house together, rebuilding transatlantic relationships while having in one of the biggest member states, in brackets Germany, an election campaign. This is going to be highly interesting. So I see three kind of tensions here. What might us help to have a wonderful transatlantic honeymoon, particularly in the area of security and defense, might bring us in Germany domestic problems. If you talk about, for example, a greater commitment in security and defense, maybe relieving the US in some areas like in Iraq, or doing more in NATO commitments, might go down very well in the transatlantic arena, might not be really wonderful in the domestic political debate and in the election campaign. So you win on the transatlantic level, but you lose on the domestic. The same could apply to the European level. Things that Germany might do in order to revive the transatlantic relationship, particularly again in security and defense, might not please our closest ally, who is France. President Macron won his election some years ago with a clearly proactive European agenda. France is looking at the current debate and is worrying whether this European momentum will carry on. So here again, we have the tension. What might help us in a transatlantic relationship might be a rather difficult moment with our closest partner, France. France has elections in 2022, and we should all be really keen in having a pro-European election result in 2022. So Germany as a likely go-to partner for a revived transatlantic relationship, or for kind of a new US government, or this kind of position is to a large extent due to the fact that Germany can rally other European countries. It's a kind of bridge builder to the smaller Central and Eastern European countries and many others. But that will not avoid a beauty contest of European countries. So the question is, how do we get this? All European countries want to commit to the new transatlantic relationship while still not entering in a contest at the expense of each other. So that I tend to think this is one of the kind of key challenges. At the same time, if Europeans will not deliver in the first 6-9 months, when asked so friendly by a new US administration, what would the conclusion be that our American speaker will then take? You have been bullied around for 4 years by Trump and you didn't deliver. Now you are friendly asked and you don't deliver. What's the conclusion from that? So I think the next months will be really, really interesting. And I think one of the first test cases, a very tiny one, but an interesting one, to what extent Europeans and the US and transatlantic work strengths can be brought together, is to what extent we will be able to coordinate the strategic compass and the new strategic compass concept in NATO. My third and last point is about what about the pandemic? We talk about transatlantic relationship in difficult times, but I wonder to what extent the real strategic game changer, where we haven't really understood the scope, might be the pandemic. The pandemic as a health crisis with secondary political, economic, and social consequences, at least in the area of security and defense, is likely to have a double effect. On the one hand, it's very likely to negatively affect the capabilities of European countries, NATO countries. That means the capacity to act. And in the same time, we can already observe that it's very likely to have a negative effect on the global security landscape. And this together is a rather dangerous mix. If international conflicts or developments intensify, but the political attention is inward-looking to Europe, and in the same time, the instruments, civilian, military, or others, financial, are on short supply, this is not really a pleasant perspective. And this is what we are already observing. So we have, what we could see over the last months is that COVID-19 is rather a catalyst that accelerates international security developments. It accelerates existing conflicts and crises. In parallel, European countries focus so much on the economic consequences that this will affect our tools or our international toolbox. That not only is the funding for military means, the budgets are likely to go down, but it's also the funding for civilian crisis prevention, civilian tools, and many other things. It's also about where the political attention is actually going of the governments. And maybe just the last word on the military dimension here. So far, the military budgets have not enormously suffered from the pandemic. We can expect them to suffer considerably in the next budget round in 2021. This will be particularly a challenge for European countries who have not fully recovered from the 2007-2008 economic crisis and the fallout. Over the last decades, European military forces lost about 35% of their capabilities, and they haven't rebuilt. So if you now again cut budgets, cut capabilities, this will seriously affect our capacity to be a valuable partner for the US. So this is something we should ponder about in terms of prevention, I would say. So the crucial question is whether Europeans have learned from the past and are no more willing to cooperate and to have a kind of provision of future developments in order to remain an interesting and valuable and capable to act partner. We will have 4 elements that will decide about to what extent Europe can be an interesting and valuable security and defense partner. And this is public budgets, security environment, transatlantic relations, and institutional coherence and coordination in defense. If we succeed in those 4 areas, I think we have quite a good basis for transatlantic relation. And I hope we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That's very extensive, and I really appreciate also how you value out the connections between domestic policy, what's happening, and the international consequences of that, and also what's happening in the dynamics on the European scene and how that connects and affects transatlantic relations, because we need to keep all those parameters in play here, and this is truly challenging. No easy way out of implementation, you said to start with, and I think you outlined that very elegantly. So I will turn to Julius now. Sweden as a very transatlantic country, also close to Germany in many issues on how we view policy, but also how we want to move forward unified in Europe as far as possible. But at the same time then with a Europe that remains open to the US in various aspects. So how do you see this no easy way out of implementation, and what is Sweden ready to contribute with in this regard?
Thank you, Anna, and thank you also to previous speakers. And I think that I was pointed out initially, I think that a strong message and a unified message has indeed been sent under German presidency from Europe and the EU on the importance of a strong transatlantic partnership based on our common interests and shared values. I mean, we have the conclusions of the European Council that was mentioned only a few days ago, the conclusions of the Foreign Affairs Council, and the joint communication of the Commission and the High Representative. So I think that Europe's position on this is very clear. And I think in general that the pandemic has shown even clearer that no single country, not the EU, not even the US, can tackle all the pressing global challenges on their own. So we need transatlantic cooperation. We need a recommitment to multilateralism, and we need a rules-based system that applies to everyone. And the answer to rising geopolitical conflict is not going it alone, nor that might makes right. And instead, we need to defend the rules-based international order that has served us so well. The common challenges that we face are manifold, and they have been mentioned. The continued fight against the pandemic and other global health issues, to tackle climate change, the need for economic recovery, as well as issues related to peace and security, democracy and human rights. And I believe that the European Union and the US have a joint interest in upholding our shared values about democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And these should be cornerstones in our common agenda moving ahead. And in this context, the proposal for a summit for democracy is a very welcome initiative at a time when the pandemic has served to put democracy, freedoms, and values under even more pressure. As was mentioned, in recent years, we've had a discussion on so-called strategic autonomy in the European Union. There have been different interpretations on what that actually means, which has also given rise to some controversy on both sides of the Atlantic. I think now is the time to focus less on terminology and more on substance. Our focus in Europe should be on improving our ability to act by enhancing decision-making capacity and operational capacity, as well as our resilience. But this must never mean protectionism. It is key that our effort also serve to strengthen our strategic partnership, including the most important one, which is the transatlantic partnership. And we must all remember that the transatlantic link is crucial for European security. I think it's clear to most that Europe needs to take a greater responsibility for its own security. But this can never be, or being perceived as being, at the expense of a strong transatlantic link. A strong transatlantic link and a stronger Europe must never be concepts that are mutually exclusive. On the contrary, they need to be mutually reinforcing. And in this way, a stronger and more able Europe will also be a stronger and better partner in the transatlantic relationship. And I think that the German presidency has, despite the difficult circumstances brought by the pandemic, managed to lead this discussion in the EU and has balanced different views in a very skillful way. Apart from the bigger issues on the budget and recovery fund and such, I would also like to mention the small but significant issue of third-party participation in the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, which is one of the security and defense initiatives that have been launched in the EU in recent years, an issue that after years of difficult negotiations, Germany managed to bring to a solution. In the same way, I'm convinced that Germany will continue to play an important role in promoting both a stronger and more resilient Europe, as well as a stronger transatlantic partnership moving forward. At the same time, we also must have realistic expectations. Europe might not in each and every respect be at the center of American attention. There are pressing domestic issues, as there are in every country, and there are other strategic issues that might be higher on the agenda than Europe, such as Asia. But I would still argue that many of those challenges also would benefit from an increased transatlantic cooperation. So in conclusion, what we need is an open discussion, as we're having here today, based on shared values, common interests, and true partnership to result in a mutual agenda for the global good and for global change. I think I will stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julius, for that and for underlying, I think, elegantly the need to not be protectionistic, but still strengthening our both operational capabilities, but also our decision making, and that's an important aspect that sometimes we tend to focus only on the capabilities, but not on our ability to act also in the political sphere. A strong link, a strong transatlantic link, and a strong Europe together. I think that's a perfect theme for Damon Wilson to capture. We heard here a fear or thinking that Europe might not always be at the center of U.S. attention anymore, that the U.S. has been in a phase of very big challenges also domestically, with the elections, spring of riots, big pandemic, and the turbulence, if I may say so, around the election and the election result and so on, as we are moving towards that. So, Damon, I just want to say before that please, to the audience, please feed in your questions in the chat. And also, if you just want to pose a question on camera, just write that. I want to pose a question on camera, and we can take care of that. Claudia will be with us until 3 o'clock. So you have a particular remark or question to Claudia, you have to hurry up with that one in order for us to capture that. But Damon, Joe Biden, more transatlantic than Obama, but can he renew American and transatlantic leadership? What is your view? What can we expect from the next administration? Please.
Simple yes to that question, Anna. First of all, Anna, it's such a pleasure to be with you. I'm delighted that the Atlantic Council's Northern Europe office and Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung are doing this series again, and really honored to be with you. And I just want to thank Stephen, Claudia, Julius, and you, Anna, because many of you in your own ways have been strong advocates for a strong Europe, a capable Europe, as a strong partner for the United States. And I think that's significant because what we're talking about in the context of Germany's EU presidency, I think this has been a consequential EU presidency because it has set the scene with a pretty breathtaking EU offer of action. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But first of all, I come to this conversation with a dose of humility, but not naivete. The humility is a recognition of the challenges that my own country has been through. I'm delighted that our Electoral College finalized our presidential election yesterday, but I'm not pleased to see how this electoral process has played out. The grievances that President Trump has ingrained in an American electorate will haunt President Biden, will divide our country going forward. And I also recognize that many of the issues on the transatlantic agenda, from some of these defense issues that Julius was just mentioning, to energy, to China, to trade, they don't just disappear with goodwill. And yet, I'm really optimistic because I see a combination of a historic opportunity with a clarity of actors who are committed to action and have begun to develop that agenda thanks to some of Stephen's good work with Joseph Borrell and what we saw coming out of the EU Council. The context for this is it really is a moment. It is a historic moment in which the geopolitical shifts have accumulated. They've been obvious, but they've really accumulated, from China's rise, the great power challenges, to the disruptive nature of technology, acceleration of climate change, to the breakdown of the rules-based international order against the backdrop of fraying of democracies and confidence in autocracies. And yet you put onto this the shock of this year, a pandemic, economic crisis, and for my own country, racial and social justice issues, which will have global ramifications. And as Joe Biden said, it really is an inflection point, much like, as we've argued, 1918, 1945, 1990. And the big wild card here has been America's role in the world. And that's the variable that's about to change most dramatically, from an American administration committed to America first to an American administration that is committed to America as a catalytic can-do nation. And this is the context for the opportunity that we're moving into a phase where we will see unity of purpose in this administration on how to rally allies and partners in global common cause, but at the same time, in a very sophisticated, savvy way, a recognition of integrating our domestic and foreign policy agendas So that one, we're really addressing the grievances that produced the last administration that persist in many countries, democracies suffering from populist backlashes. But they also help align our domestic and our foreign policy priorities so that we don't need to sequence, we can move. And what does that mean? You're going to see coming out of Washington a Biden commitment to investing in the sources of American strength at home so we can refurbish our foundation of international leadership. And that's one part values and it's one part effectiveness. And so it's this intersection of domestic and international. It's why Susan Rice has headed the Domestic Policy Council. It's why Jake Sullivan has developed a foreign policy for the middle class. And this means tackling the pandemic, economic recovery, and infrastructure investment in our democratic institutions and processes, social cohesion, immigration policy for the 21st century, all of that. And these have a direct interlay between domestic and foreign priorities where they can be integrated in an approach. Second is this overlay with an unyielding emphasis on reinvigorating our alliances and our historic partnerships. And even Biden himself has said it's not just, back to valuing these, but it is an ability to reimagine them, and hence of thinking about developing more common strategies among democracies, about how to link our Atlantic allies and partners with our Pacific allies and partners on a common agenda. And I think that's what's important. That's what's been spelled out in the EU offer. Third is this doubling down on international institutions where you won't see American reservations go away about some of the challenges that we've faced in the UN or WHO. However, you will see a dramatic change in commitment on how we don't cede that space to China and others, how we compete, how we push for reforms, how we, of course, rejoin Paris, WTO. And I hope take the EU up on an offer on developing a common agenda for action there. And the final pillar here is really the values one. It's recognizing that democracy, human rights, human dignity are going to be at the center of a Biden policy. And I think in partnership with the EU. And this is where that EU offer comes into play. Stephen, you're right. The system has worked. It's breathtaking. The EU process didn't water down what I thought would be coming out of Brussels. It actually bolstered the offer that's come forward. It's a call for collective action. It's premised on something that the Biden administration, Americans can stand behind. A united, capable, and self-reliant Europe can be good for the transatlantic relationship, with a very clear parallel agenda on a healthier world, protecting the planet, tech, trade, and standards, and this safer, more democratic sort of security and democracy bundle. It's bold in terms of a green trade agenda, a green tech alliance. This is something that I think is now shifted the onus from Europe to get ready for this opportunity, shifting the onus back to the Americans, back to the Biden administration to take Europe up on this bold offer. I'm going to close, Anna, just with saying, I said I start with humility and not naivete, but I am bullish. I am optimistic because I see three big opportunities in the next 4 years. One is how we fix ourselves at home and we leverage renewal at home in the United States to be a source of inspiration and strength on the international stage. Second, how we as Americans begin to formulate a new model of leadership that has the hope of getting some bipartisan support that is neither chest-thumping bravado nor lead from behind, but a more catalytic approach to leading with our friends and partners. And finally, third, that we can really get back into action with a pretty bold agenda on how not just to tread water, but how we get ahead of shaping this future, how we adapt the international system to this new order. That is a very, very brash, bold agenda that is underlying a relatively humble and modest president. And the offer from the EU gives me hope there's a chance we might make progress on those three.
Thank you so much, Damon. That's very inspirational, and I like this America as a catalytic can-do nation instead of America first. I think that will be very much appreciated among many who are pretty tired of just that concept, I think, and do not see it as very constructive in world politics. So that's inspirational. So both a lot of healing to do internally, domestically, to get that strength at home in the United States in order to project kind of a new strength abroad, you can say, in a different manner, together with other democracies, and not only the West, then, as Stephen pointed out, but democracies also in what we have perceived as new areas, perhaps, of joining alliances in Asia and so on. So I want to open up to, we have questions coming in. I'm very happy with that, so I'm going to jump directly to that and just feed in the panel. So Julius, I have nearby to grab, but for the rest also you can just wave in the panelist, wave in the camera and I'll feed you in. So we have, first I saw the question from Ian Anthony at CIPRI. This was to Stephen, you can start, but you other ones can feed in also. So Stephen, could you say something more about finding a joint approach to China? This 2nd December agreement suggests that there is agreement on the problem, but not on the solution. Is that a Trump-specific assertion, or is it true for the US in general? The document points to the EU-US dialogue on China. How is this being organized, and is it clear how it will be carried forward by the new administration? So that's an excellent question, I think, because it also illustrates that, in my view, the EU and the US often view a problem in the same way, but we have not been able to find the road, the solutions to these problems. We are not hooking up and solving these problems together, and that's where we want to get back to. So, Stephen, if you start and the other ones can feed in. China, that's a major issue.
Absolutely, very happy to start off, but looking forward to the colleagues coming in as well. It's a great question. I mean, I think that the transatlantic relationship can only remain relevant and vigorous if it's geared towards, real challenges. And it's clear, I think, for everybody to see that, China has developed into such a strong partner, but also challenge and rival at the same time, that we need to also bring this into the transatlantic agenda and dialogue. As I think colleagues know, we've launched a formal dialogue on this very issue at the tail end of the Trump administration, and I think that spoke to the fact that also under an administration with whom we had, frankly, relatively difficult relations, we were able to agree that this was a suitable topic for US-European dialogue. It is clear that with the Biden incoming administration, this will not only continue, but I think we'll get greater impetus, because everything that we've been discussing has a China angle, and everything that Biden, I think, seeks to achieve internationally has a China component, and also would strengthen and benefit from EU-US cooperation. Now, I want to speak to this point. Will we always agree? No, we will not always agree. Also on China, I mean, that was the case before Donald Trump came into office. It will remain the case also during Joe Biden's term, and it includes also the China aspects of all this. But the way we approach it, and the phrase and the approach is we are sitting at the same side of the table. There's no equidistance between the United States, Europe, and China in this sort of triangular model. We're with the United States when it comes to the nature of our political system, the nature of our economic system. So we're much closer to the US than we are to China. This is not only true, incidentally, for a political and societal point of view, it's even true in geographic terms. The distance between Brussels and Washington is less than between Brussels and Beijing. So if you want to condense it into those terms, this will maybe help you retain this point. Having said that, it's of course also true that the nature of our relationship of China and the depth of our economic and investment relationship is such that there is no support in Europe for a decoupling strategy. So it's about influencing the choices that China will make and teaming up with the United States and other like-minded partners. And I want to emphasize that point I made earlier, when you take the instance of market access, it's not only the United States and Europe that have profound concerns about some economic practices of China over a number of years. You will hear the same thing from the Japanese, or from the Koreans, or from the Indians and the Australians and others. And one thing that has been a regret on the side of the EU is that we haven't been able to cooperate as strongly as we ought to have with the countries I mentioned on these questions of, let's say, the economic practices of China. And that has led to a reduction of our collective leverage and collective influence. So we want to strengthen this going forward in a number of fields. I just mentioned also 5 to 6G. There are many other aspects. I'll leave it here.
Thank you. Who wants to come next? Claudia, you have anything on China agenda? We will not always agree, Stephen said. How can we move forward, in your view?
I think that was pretty comprehensive, so I think
yes.
I would keep.
Damon, from the other side of the Atlantic?
I just think the most fundamental point here is that for the American approach, the United States moved dramatically in the past 4 years, despite the political polarization, towards a bipartisan consensus on the challenge that China presents. Finding the balance between competition and cooperation is going to be tough. That's at the heart of the discussion. But the singular point the Trump administration failed to do, and which the Biden administration has the opportunity to do, is that if we're going to get the rest of the world, these issues, big issues, right, we need to be sitting with our allies and partners on the other side of the table from China. It's the leverage that we gain, not just from the United States and Europe working together. It's the United States and Europe with our Indo-Pacific partners and allies, including India, together in negotiations within multilateral settings vis-a-vis Beijing. And that's the most important point, that we don't just forge a common approach with the EU, but we bring democracies and other partners in common cause on some issues where we can have greater leverage in negotiations with Beijing.
Thank you. I just want to turn to Julius, because Sweden took a pretty bold decision regarding 5G and Huawei. And we are not waiting for a EU's kind of position on this, but we are moving forward. So how do you see the importance of having US-EU alignment on the China agenda?
Well, on that specific issue, of course, there is a common EU framework when it comes to that issue, and there is also a specific Swedish national legislation that was adopted earlier this year, and that legislation is not directed against any country. It's a neutral legislation, so to call. And what it says is, of course, that when the competent authority in Sweden that handles the coming auction about the frequencies on the 5G networks, when they do that, they will have to take into consideration the security aspects of the future networks. And when they do that, they will have to consult with the armed forces and the security services. And that is what they have done. And then they have made an independent decision, which translated into what you just mentioned. But at the same time, the national legislation also applies for the right to appeal. So there is now a judicial process that is ongoing, and we don't know the outcome of that yet, so that remains to be seen. But in general, I think that all European countries have more or less the same policy when it comes to China. I mean, we see, of course, that there are opportunities as well as challenges. And I think for everyone, it's clear that we need to cooperate with China on issues such as global health issues, for example, tackling climate change, and continue our economic exchange and the trade issues also. At the same time, we all know that there are challenges related to that as well. Democracy, human rights was mentioned. We also have rules and norms governing cyberspace, for example, technology issues. So, I mean, I think that there is a common understanding a little bit on what issues that we need to discuss between each other, but also how we need to relate to China on issues of mutual interest.
Thank you. So now we have, I will take a few questions, and you can pick which ones, and some of for the whole panel as well. Let me see so I don't miss anyone here. So from Matthew Rhodes to all panelists, could the panelists elaborate further on the role of big tech within next year's transatlantic agenda? And then from Elin Schiffer at the Atlantic Council, even if Biden won the election, over 74 million people still voted for President Trump. A lot of Europeans are concerned with the long-term effects of Trumpism. Do you think long-term trust in the transatlantic relationship has been damaged permanently? So both on the role of big tech in the coming years and on the matter of trust and how harmful these past 4 years have been for the transatlantic relationship long term. And then we have a third question. I'll feed that one in as well, and you can pick and choose a bit. On the EU-NATO cooperation, how do the panelists see the coordination between the US-EU dialogue on the one hand and NATO cooperation on the other hand? Also, as NATO and EU memberships don't fully overlap. So are we facing two various forums here for security discussions, one in NATO and one EU-led? And can we have that and still move forward on the transatlantic agenda? So who wants to start? We start with Washington, D.C. this time, Damon.
All right, please do. Just quickly on these 3 points. First, the big tech issue. The big debate that we've seen in our newspapers and the public space has really been the EU as a regulatory superpower and where the United States is, and differences in standards and data privacy, all of that between the United States and Europe. I think the big challenge we face over the next couple of years is how to align a more sort of maybe favorable approach in Washington to work with Europe on tech issues so that the free world, the democracies of the world, are focused on the big issue, which is how do we set the common standards vis-a-vis the world and vis-a-vis challenges from authoritarian governments. And so I see this as an urgent challenge and task because I think it's one of the most difficult. Aligning the United States and Europe, along with Japan and others, quickly on a tech agenda so that we are better equipped to help set the standards that free and open societies can set global standards rather than a Chinese-led authoritarian approach to tech issues. Second, on the Ellen's question, insightful question on the lingering effect in the United States, I am worried. I mean, I think, first of all, it's very clear the United States is not a progressive country. This is a relatively centrist country. And it's also very clear that issues of, whether it's socialism or defund the police or a radical green agenda, that doesn't really resonate in a way that's sweeping across the United States. It speaks to some of the strengths of Donald Trump's electorate. I think the real challenge is what's the future of the Republican Party and Donald Trump's role in that. And I think it's going to be messy. I think it's going to be difficult. And so we're now positioning to have a president leave office with a great grievance, with millions of Americans believing that our election was stolen, which is ridiculous. There will be this great grievance that will provide suck the oxygen out of the debate among conservatives on the right in the United States. And so this is going to have a lot to do with where is the future heart and soul of a Republican Party that looks nothing like it did several years ago. And it will have outsized consequences on America's role in the world, our relationship with others. The challenge here is that even during the Trump years, Republicans in the Senate and Congress maintained a fairly traditional view and approach towards America's role in the world and their relationship with Europe. That's just not where the president was. We'll see the biggest change on an issue like relations with Germany, relations with the EU. But the question is, where does that land in the future of the party? And finally, EU-NATO. I don't think there's a lot of patience and tolerance for that debate in Washington so much right now. There's a sense of urgency about big issues and that we get lost at navel gazing among ourselves when we get too into the weeds on the EU-NATO issue. I think there's going to be more of a focus on what the EU offer was, a call to action, focus on what are we trying to achieve, how do we achieve it, and how do we align our instruments and institutions to achieve those objectives. Where NATO and the EU, whether it is dealing with the Mediterranean, Europe's East. We need an integrated, comprehensive strategy that leverages both the EU and NATO. And increasingly on defense, that those discussions are not happening without each other at the table.
Thank you. I will move to Claudia because I know you need to leave us. Please, Claudia.
Thank you, Anna. I will just, given that I have to run off in a minute, I will just pick up the trust question, because I think it's a really, really important one. Trust is one of those questions or of those elements which you can't really measure. You somehow feel if it's there, you somehow feel if it's not there, but it's very difficult to measure how much trust you have or how to rebuild it. And if you look in the transatlantic relationship, you could probably say that we have 4 factors that will define how the future transatlantic relationship will develop. That's the domestic factors in the US, the party politics that Damon mentioned, the international strategic development, to what extent or how important this relationship still is, and the European development. That would be this kind of new framework in which we decide how we will live, how we will shape the transatlantic relationship. And I explicitly share the worries that that you formulated, Damon. And I think we could probably put it in one simplistic question, and we could probably ask: was Trump the exception? This is what we all Europeans are hoping for, or is Biden the exception? That would be the nightmare we would like to avoid. So, what is coming after Biden? And if you put it in that really, I know, overly simplistic question, then we have the sense of urgency, what we need to get done in the next 4 years. Because then we have 4 years to show that this relationship is worth it, that it's actually delivers, and that we are all committed to build it up. That's not really reassuring, I have to admit, because 4 years, as we know in politics, I'm talking about defense, is nothing. But I think if we have that as kind of motivation, as urgency and motivation in mind, that would probably help us a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Claudia, for joining us today and your busy schedule and before Christmas and before the lockdown in Germany as well. So we wish you all the best and hope to see you soon. Thank you. And then any more comments? Stephen is with us still. Stephen, would you like to comment, please?
No, absolutely. Quickly, because a lot of good things have already been said. On the technology, I wanted to maybe say the following, that Europeans like to tell themselves the following story. And the story goes like this, that there are 3 choices or 3 models that exist on technology and data. I mean, you can either have the American approach and the data belong to the platforms. You can have the Chinese approach and the data belong to the state and the security apparatus linked to it. Or you can have the European approach, and that's when the data belong to you. And I'm told by people who know this file much better than I do that this is less and less true, this story. Because the capacity of also the EU to regulate big tech is not keeping pace with the speed and the scope of change that we're seeing. And what Damon told us, in a way, is something similar is also happening in the United States, where I think increasing numbers of people are also recognizing at that side that the US approach hasn't delivered the kinds of protections that you need to see and the kinds of security, but also economic handling of these challenges, that I think it's actually, the time is quite ripe for the EU and the US to come together a bit in the direction that he sketched out of finding regulations and outcomes in this domain that suit the kind of open democratic societies that we are and want to remain into the future. So I think it's a very important topic for transatlantic dialogue. And just to say, the Commission has today come forward with a number of proposals that I think fit into that spirit. Last, just a half sentence on EU-NATO. There are tons of problems that we have in the world, and our capacity to cope doesn't keep pace with the number of challenges that we have. EU-NATO is not one of them. Honest to God, I want to tell colleagues, I mean, there are many, many problems that we have in the world, but EU-NATO relations, they're good. I mean, actually, as of today, Secretary General Stoltenberg was in the Berlaymont, the building of the European Commission. I mean, dialogue and cooperation takes place at all levels. That's not where the problems are. The problems are we don't know what to do with Turkey. The problems are we have problems in the Mediterranean, in the cybersphere, in Russia, and so on and so forth. So I would strongly plead for a challenge-focused discussion. What do we need to do on these challenges? And then fit in relationships in function of that. Thanks.
Thank you. Julius, Sweden is a member of the EU, but not of NATO. We value the transatlantic relations very much. Regardless, what is our approach to this puzzle? Is it a conflict for us, or
no?
How
I
do
mean,
we approach
needless
it?
to say, I mean, we very strongly support the EU-NATO cooperation and the increased cooperation that we have seen taking place over the past few years. And I think that there's great potential in that cooperation, and we've already seen it happening. I mean, EU and NATO, they have different roles and different purposes, as we all know. They also have different toolboxes. And I think that the EU has many tools at its disposal that are very important in tackling some of the common security challenges that we see in Europe, but also beyond Europe. And I'm thinking then of tackling hybrid threats and cyber issues and etc. So I think that cooperation is very important and mutually beneficial to both EU and NATO. And I don't see a risk that a separate EU-US dialogue will somehow have a negative effect on the EU-NATO cooperation, because these are different organizations and they have different roles to play.
Thank you. I think we have a follow-up question on China from Alexandra Martin with Globsec in Brussels. Follow-up to Stephen. How do we close the gap within Europe when it comes to priorities, perception vis-à-vis China? Our recent Globsec Trends report shows that in all Central and Eastern European countries, more than 50% of people do not see China as a threat at all. If you could address that. And then I would like perhaps to round up, since you're all such skilled diplomats, and also Damon with a background in administration, what would be your best offer? I mean, if you had to set the agenda in order to get this relationship back on track, what would be the best offer? Please. Start with Stephen then. You can follow up on China and then give us your best offer.
Okay. Well, Alex puts a legitimate question, right? There's a range of views on all foreign policy questions, including also China. And as the old adage says, where you stand depends on where you sit. And of course, the world looks different if you are from Central Europe than if you are from the Mediterranean or from Northern Europe, as we are doing today. But I think that the overall trend is towards a more realistic approach towards China across the board. So our starting positions are perhaps not the same, but we are converging in Europe towards a more realistic read of China, which says that we of course want to cooperate with China on many files where its role is essential, but we are acutely aware of a number of the challenges that China's international behavior also represents. And this is no longer a bilateral relation, but a globally significant relation, and that China has come closer to Europe and has become more influential on a number of international challenges. And I think that is also recognized in Central Europe, where perhaps in the past the prism was more the investment side of the relationship and what kind of investments can I expect in what time of conditions, towards a more open and rounded perception of China, including also some of the more problematic aspects of its behavior. So I think we're converging from different starting positions. That's my point on that. On the offer, I think the best that Europe can do is to substantiate the offer that we've made now collectively at 27 in the field of security, in the field of climate change, in the field of the recovery, and to be understanding of the other challenges that the Biden administration will have to grapple with, but also suitably impatient to put this relationship to work, because I think the timing aspects that many of us have stressed is really essential. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Going to Julius.
Thank you. Well, I agree very much with what Stephen said, and I think that the offer is on the table already. And I think that, as I said initially, this message has been very strong, and it's a unified message coming from Europe. And I think that if we can re-engage together in multilateral fora, if we can stand up for democratic values, and if we can together defend the European security order and as well stand up for the comprehensive concept of security that Sweden will of course champion when we pick up the chairpersonship in the OSCE in just a few weeks, I think that's a very good start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julius. So Damon, last words to you.
Julius is right that the EU has made a breathtaking offer. So I think the best thing we need to do going forward, we need to commit that as key partners, that we're going to consult on all these major global issues with the objective of trying to forge common approaches, if not common strategies on them, so that together the United States and Europe can be a force for good in the world, that we can be a source of inspiration based on the values that our societies have built on. And I think to what end, I would hope that that offer would be that through our own renewal at home, our own cooperation together, we can help sort of support what could become a new, renewed fourth democratic wave and end this recession of democracies globally and see the advance of democracies, the retreat of autocracies, and perhaps as a nice transition to your next panel, that progress can begin with the common support of the people of Belarus.
Thank you so much, Damon, for those inspirational closing words. And I think that also leads up very well to the next panel that we will have on the future of Belarus, a true important issue, core issue for European leadership and transatlantic relations ahead. Please join me in thanking the panel for excellent contributions and for the audience for all the questions that you fed in. We will have a short break, resume at 3:20. 15:20, and then Gabriel Baumann, who is heading the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung office here for the Nordic countries, will lead the discussion ahead. So please come back and join us then. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your great work.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you soon again.
Good to connect. Thanks. Well done. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
A warm welcome from the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in Stockholm. And thank you, Anna Wieslander and the Atlantic Council for the very good cooperation. We continue our discussion on European leadership with a panel about Belarus. Repressions of Lukashenko's regime against peaceful demonstrators in Minsk and other parts of Belarus have been going on for 4 months now. More than 30,000 people have been arrested as of last weekend. Police is even following people into their homes in order to beat and detain them. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, the leader of the opposition, is in Berlin these days and has had, among others, a meeting with President Walter Steinmeier and members of the German Bundestag. Tomorrow she is in Brussels for a meeting with High Representative Josep Borrell, and will then be rewarded the Sakharov Prize by the European Parliament. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya has also been in Stockholm quite recently for talks with the government, the Riksdag, and civil society organizations. As we can see, there is a strong support for her as leader of the opposition, representing the will of people in Belarus. The manipulated results of August presidential elections have never been recognized by any country in the European Union. European Union leaders called several times on the Belarusian authorities to end violence and repression, to release all political prisoners, to respect media freedom and civil society, and to start an inclusive national dialogue. The European Council imposed sanctions against 59 individuals for election falsification and repressions. Lukashenko is since November one of them. Is that enough? Or what else can the European Union do in order to stop violence and to help improve the situation in Belarus? What can Sweden do during its OSCE chairmanship in 2021? To discuss these questions, we have invited 3 distinguished guests. We will have statements, I would ask you, from 8 to 10 minutes. And later we will have questions from the audience through the Q&A button. Valery Kovalevsky is the newly appointed representative of Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya on international affairs. He was a diplomat for Belarus until 2006 and has been working since then, among other things, for Voice of America and the World Bank. Kent Herstedt was a member of the Swedish Riksdag until 2018, and he has been engaged with Belarus for many years. Since 2017, he is the special representative of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for Eastern Europe. Olof Ehrencrona is a former diplomat, government official, and since 2019 editorial writer for Svenska Dagbladet. He has been actively engaged in supporting the opposition in Belarus since the late 90s. But before we start our discussion with our distinguished speakers, I would like to show a short 5 minutes video greeting from Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, which has been recorded for us this morning in Berlin. Please.
Speakers and organizers, it's a pleasure and honor to speak in front of you today. I'm delighted that the issue of Belarus and our peaceful struggle for free and fair elections remains at the top of the international agenda. It pains me to say that the Belarusian crisis hasn't taken a turn for the better yet. On the contrary, it has only gotten worse. More than 32,000 demonstrators have been detained since August. In particular, security forces have arrested more than 380 students and 379 journalists, 5 of whom are still in prison. The list of political prisoners reached 156 names and is only growing. Every day brings a new tragic story, a new heartbroken family, more injustice and impunity from the regime. That's why we need urgent action from the international community. Our goal is to have free and fair elections to return freedom to Belarusians and make sure that rule of law prevails. We need your support in our peaceful struggle. We are asking to help us restore justice by launching universal jurisdiction cases against those responsible for crimes against Belarusians wherever possible. We are grateful to the Lithuanians for taking the lead. The first case of Maxim Haroshin was recently accepted by Lithuanian authorities. Maxim is the owner of a flower shop in Minsk who was brutalized by Belarusian police for giving away flowers to the protesters at the Women's March. In addition to launching universal jurisdiction investigations, We insist on implementing the recommendations of the OSCE's Moscow Mechanism report. We are hopeful that the Swedish chairmanship of the OSCE in the coming year would help advance this issue. We are very grateful for the thorough work conducted by Professor Benedek and the recommendations in his report. I believe that the absolute priority is an independent and transparent international investigation of all allegations of torture and ill treatment. I am proud to announce that we are ready to organize genuine elections with extensive international monitoring as the report recommends. Moreover, we have planned describing how to do that in under 60 days. We are also urging our partners to impose broader individual and targeted economic sanctions. We want to see mid-level officials and executors of unlawful orders on the sanction lists beside their high-ranking bosses. All international cooperation with Belarusian state-owned enterprises, where the majority of repressions against the workers takes place, should be suspended. We are grateful for the extended EU for Belarus program contributing towards civic empowerment of Belarusians. It will help Belarusian civil society and independent media, youth, small businesses and health workers function under severe pressure in the short term. Thank you for your support, and we would be most happy to discuss long-term assistance plans for democratic Belarus. Please do remember that your voice is important, but it is actions that matter. Please be there for Belarusians and rest assured that Belarusians will do the same for you in the future. Long live Belarus.
Yeah, thank you. I think this was a very clear and very strong message from Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. And I would like now to ask Valery Kovalevsky as our first speaker to react on her message. So is there anything you would like to add? Or there has been and still is a lot of moral and financial support from the EU for people in Belarus. And she also spoke about EU programs supporting civil society. Would you say that together with the sanction policy the EU is carrying out right now, it's these 59 individual sanctions I mentioned, is this enough to improve the situation inside Belarus? Valery, please, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this event, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion among such great speakers, people who devoted their careers to Belarus and know the mission in Belarus inside out. I hope you hear me well. I'm not sure if the feed is good enough for you. Can you please let me know if the signal is strong enough?
It's good, we can hear you.
Excellent. So the situation in Belarus continues to be getting worse, unfortunately. One number from the statistics that I would like to present to you is that the number of arrests, now the days that were the people were put under arrest, they have amounted to 156 years altogether for all the people who have been arrested since August 9. And it has been like 32,000 people arrested. This number is growing, and until recently, the authorities were sort of reluctant to cross the boundaries, some boundaries. For example, every Monday we have a march, a rally of seniors, of people who are retired, sort of thinking that it would be a call for wisdom from people who are wise. And until recently, the authorities restrained themselves from attacking them. But just yesterday, more than 90 people were immediately arrested on the spot, just for assembling in one place. Those were the seniors, some of them in their 80s. So this just shows that the authorities are sort of not seeing any boundaries any longer. The lawlessness has become so pervasive that they kind of don't see limits to that. In general, I would say that the authorities in their crackdown on the protest have gone on the counteroffensive. They have managed to push the protest from the center of the cities, first in the sort of neighborhoods, then in their backyards. Now the authorities are trying to push into the apartments of people. And if they see, for example, that there's a flag, national symbol flag, displayed on the window or on the balcony of the apartment, the private property of people. They see no limits to themselves. They can enter the apartment, they break in, sometimes in very early hours, and they can arrest people and they can confiscate the symbols of this. At the same time, it seems that this tactic is the only one that Lukashenko is pursuing. He relies on the violence and violence only. He does not take any efforts to establish and run any political dialogue with genuine political dialogue with political forces. All the attempts that he is trying to demonstrate are sort of surrogates, essentially. For example, he has initiated the preparation of the All Belarusian National Assembly, and he started speaking about making it a constitutional body with very uncertain authority, very uncertain status. And it's not even clear if it would be sort of reflected in the constitution of Belarus. It's just another attempt to sort of distract people, and instead of establishing, reaching out across political spectrum and trying to have a dialogue on the situation in Belarus, he again tries to crack down on the one hand on the people who are willing to protest, and on the other one is to have this sham sort of that would be again just covering his political bankruptcy. What's important about the protest in Belarus, it still continues. People are not giving up. I've been there just a week ago. I myself was arrested on November 22nd during the rally. I spent two days in the prison, and I was lucky enough to get out of the prison just to pay the fine. But people who go every Sunday on the street, who every evening have these small marches around their buildings, they know the risk and they take the risk knowingly. They know that this situation cannot stand any longer, and Lukashenko is not an acceptable leader of Belarus. So I would like to turn now to the international arena, like what's going on for Lukashenko and how the international community reacts to the situation in Belarus. The foreign policy of the Lukashenko regime has essentially stopped. There is no movement. There are no meetings. There are no attempts of Lukashenko's Minister of Foreign Affairs, his diplomacy, to reach out to explain the events in Belarus. The only counterpart he has for now is just Russia and nobody else. In contrast, you can see that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is traveling the European continent. She's reaching out to leaders in the Northern America. She has had a number of meetings. Yesterday, she met with the federal president of Germany. Now she's in Brussels, meeting Prime Minister of Belgium, meeting high-ranking officials from the European Union structures. So this shows that the international community is really well informed about the situation in Belarus and knows that this situation cannot stand. This kind of behavior is not acceptable any longer. At the same time, measures and the reactions of the international community have been limited essentially to symbolic reactions. Yes, Lukashenko is not recognized as a legitimate leader of Belarus. Yes, European powers in the see Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as legitimate leader of Belarus. But at the same time, the sanctions that have been introduced are symbolic. They are mostly about sort of punishing individuals who sometimes don't even leave Belarus, or targeting individual enterprises. And we know that this process is really difficult because Belarusian oligarchs who support Lukashenko, who support his regime, are actually lobbying the sanction lists, and they succeed in this, unfortunately. So I would say in this connection that we should be aware that there's always a possibility of a negative scenario in Belarus, that Lukashenko might prevail, that his crackdown actually might reach to the bottom of his kind of suggested destination, that people are pacified, that people give up, that people do not pursue this idea of free and democratic Belarus. What this is going to mean for democratic societies, for the international community who are concerned about the situation in Belarus, this will be yet another example of failed policy to advance and protect democracy in the world. Belarus might be this new example of sort of aspirations that have never materialized. People in Belarus, for the first probably time in the independent history, have stood up for freedom in such huge masses and for such long time. And so this is now a good time for international community, for Western democracies in the first place, to step in and defend. And what we are asking about is to implement the measures to stop the violence in Belarus, to stop the lawlessness in Belarus. And this should be the first step to initiate the political dialogue, the process that would lead to the presidential elections that would be free and fair and recognized by the international community. I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to hearing the remarks from other participants and to your questions. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valery, for your very interesting contribution. I would now like to ask Kent Hersted as our next speaker. You have listened to what Svetlana Tikhanovskaya said in her message, and she also addressed the OSCE. So you have been to Belarus many times, Kent, and you also have been the OSCE Special Coordinator for Election Monitoring in Belarus in 2016. And you have also personally met Lukashenko. So what do you think? What could Sweden, what could the chairmanship next year, Sweden as the taking over the chairmanship in 2021, what could Sweden do and what could the OSCE do in order to improve the situation?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak and address this issue, and also to share a few reflections on the incoming Swedish chairmanship of the OSCE. Of course, first of all, it is an approach which is of course, the approach of OSCE is to be an inclusive organization, and that is different to having maybe a more tougher stand, and it's rather to use the opportunities of OSCE as a platform to see if there can be a reach out, and if OSCE could be used as a platform for dialogue and some kind of platform to find the solutions to the violence that we are seeing at this point. Sweden as a country have been very tough and very straightforward in its criticism about what we have been seeing in Belarus in this last year, but also throughout the years. And we have in various ways expressed that very clearly. Our foreign minister have been very outspoken in this matter. But when from 1st of January, we have to be the chairman of the whole of OSCE, and that is including countries like Russia, of course, and Belarus itself. Belarus itself have throughout the years used OSCE and in a way that they would like to see Belarus as a platform for dialogue between East and West. Now, of course, with what we have been seeing this last year, we are in a totally different situation. And I can just think that Lukashenko and the leadership of the regime is how to say, reflecting on what kind of relation they want to have to OSCE. The two of the Troika members, the foreign minister of Albania and the foreign minister of Sweden, have written a letter to Lukashenko and offering OSCE as a platform for dialogue, and to see if they would be willing to use OSCE in that aspect. We have not received any answer on that letter, but we have neither received a yes nor a no. And what we can say is that we think that Belarus is keeping this option open, and maybe we will see some kind of developments here in the spring. But let me share a few reflections of what I see. I think that the regime in Belarus is trying to exhaust the uprising, the popular uprising they are seeing. I think what Lukashenko said when he was meeting the prisoners and had some kind of, what to say, roundtable discussion with them, was that he expressed that he misread two things. One was the COVID-19 and the other was the young generation. And I think it's here we can see some part of their own explanation of this uprising, because I think they are trying to find the explanations in the shortcomings of reading the situation. I know by contacts with them that, for example, they see 160,000 migrant workers that normally works in other countries that are back in Belarus as one important factor which they think will calm down the uprising later in the spring, when some of these 160,000 workers return back to whether it will be Poland or Germany or whatever. And they think that by that, some of the steam will go out of the uprising. I think they are misreading the situation once again. This is something much bigger than that, and they are about to make a big mistake if they underestimate the strength and the broad displeasure with which have taken place. So from the OSCE perspective, we will continue to do the outreach. We have had dialogues with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her team, and we are reaching out to the Belarus regime side to see if the time is right to have a channel of dialogue or a platform of communication to see in what way we can move forward, because this will not end. And there is one important factor to that, and that is that you cannot actually, by pressure and threats and violence, actually oppress people to silence. I think we are way beyond that. I have followed developments in Belarus for the last 20-25 years, and what we are seeing now, we have never seen anything like this throughout this long period of time. 2010 was a violent crackdown on the demonstrators, but the numbers and the size and the broad sentiments of displeasure with the leadership was not at all as broad all over the country as it is at this point. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for Ken for these reflections. I would ask our participants. I was told you should put your questions or feed in your questions in the chat button, not the Q&A button, but the chat button, so I can read it from here. Yeah, I would then now like to ask Olof Ehrenkorner for his input. He is, as Kent mentioned himself, Olof has also been with the engaged with Belarus and having had talks with the Belarusian opposition for 25 years now, so very well experienced when it comes to make an assessment of what is going on now in Belarus compared to what has been the situation even 20 years ago, and also what the EU can do in order to mobilize democracy. This is what Stephen Everts said in our first panel. So Olaf, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya spoke in her message about very concrete measures to help Belarusian people. What would you say? I mean, there is now a real chance for the EU to improve something in the country. She spoke about programs, she spoke about civil society, strengthen civil society. What would you say with your experience? What could the EU now do, or what should the EU do for Belarus?
Yeah, thank you for having me here, and thank you for the previous remarks. Let me start with saying that I totally agree with Kent that it is a big difference what happens now and what we have seen before in Belarus. This is something very, very different and very hopeful, and it is a part of a long process starting in 1989 and being continued up till now. But Belarus has, of course, been a special case within the framework of liberation of Eastern and Central Europe, and a special case also when it comes to the change after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I believe that we should be aware of the long-term process that we are viewing. I think it's one of the issues or the question that is put forward in the paper here is what effect can the Swedish chairmanship of the OSCE have on the situation in Belarus. I would rephrase it to say, what can Sweden do? And the chairmanship of OSCE is an important thing. Why? Because the whole European peace and security order is basically based on the founding documents of OSCE. It goes back to Helsinki Final Act in 1975, the Paris Charter in 1990, and the Istanbul documents from 1999. Those three kind of papers are the basic framework for the OSCE. And OSCE as an organizational body was founded in 1995, and since then it has expanded. It's now 57 members, from Mongolia in the east to US and Canada in the west. It's quite a big organization with quite a number of participants, more or less a third of the United Nations. And it's fair to say that the moment Belarus is in right now is such a process that OSCE was and is meant to deal with. The peaceful transition of power in a country that do not fulfill the basic democratic criteria and, as we have seen, has not been capable of conducting free and fair elections. The question is then if the OSCE will be able to fulfill its most essential mission. And I would say it depends. It depends, of course, on the Belarus government, and they are not especially cooperative, which we have seen for the last decades. It's called the last dictatorship in Europe. But it also depends on Moscow and the EU, that is Brussels. Belarus is a part of the Eastern Partnership, which is to a certain degree also involves the Belarusian state authorities. And that has, of course, been a complicating factor. But it is also very much about EU cooperation with the civil society. But as we have heard, Belarus is also targeted for EU sanctions, and EU does not recognize the regime as a fully legitimate government, since the elections are not recognized as free and fair, and as we know, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is seen as the legitimate winner of the election. The situation in Moscow is more complicated, to put it mildly. Since 2009, Russia has put forward proposals that would change the Helsinki-Paris-Istanbul order of European security. And they want to change the European security order to an order based on spheres of influences and not as it is today, based on all nations' equal rights to sovereignty. And it is fairly obvious that if Russia looks for a candidate to be subordinated within the Russian sphere of influence, it's obvious that Belarus is such a candidate. Consequently, there are strong incentives in Kremlin to get EU and the OSCE to acknowledge such a shift, using Belarus as a pretext, and then this way get a precedent case. I would then say that the minimum standard for the Swedish chairmanship is to reject all attempts from Russia to use the situation in Belarus to undermine the existing order of peace and security in Europe. This is about Belarus' territorial and domestic and political integrity and sovereignty, but not only about Belarus, it's also very much about all other European countries and their equal rights to sovereignty and their equal rights to choose who they want to cooperate with and to what extent they want such a cooperation to be formed. So that is the minimum standard that Sweden must live up to. Since the Helsinki Accord and the Paris Treaty and the Istanbul document is a very, very important part of the Swedish diplomatic arsenal and very much a part of Swedish diplomatic history, I would say that I'm quite sure that we will live up to that standard. But it's important to understand that Russia has interests of Belarus per se, but Russia has also interested to change the European peace and security order. So backing the opposition in Belarus is of fundamental importance. Be very, very firm in our attitudes towards the present regime in Minsk is extremely important. I agree fully that sanctions must be implemented that are not only symbolic, but I also think it's essential to keep up the dialogue with the Belarus civil society. The EU's main instrument is, of course, the Eastern Partnership and all the programs that are within that partnership. I think that it has been, with regard to the civil society, quite a success story in many ways. We have had 3,000 students within the from Belarus within the Erasmus program, and we have had more than 3,000 within other programs for young people. The European University in Vilnius is doing very well and has a lot of good merits with regard to Belarus. The Horizon program for enhancing innovation and research capacity is also an important aspect. All in all, the EU strategy to build human capital capacity in Belarus, working with the civil society, is basically the right strategy. And that should be combined with a firm approach with regard to sanctions towards those who are responsible for the violence and the human rights crimes. EU, as well as OSCE, I mean, the human dimension within the OSCE, which is about media freedom, human rights in general, is of course extremely important in this respect with regard to the situation in Belarus. And Sweden, as the chairman, has of course a responsibility to be firm and see that this human dimension is really used in order to put pressure on the regime in Minsk and to create space for the civil society in Belarus to act. That is, I would say, maybe the most important priority for the OSCE chairmanship, and it's to safeguard the human dimension with respect to the situation there. I think all in all that OSCE in many respects has been quite successful actually with regard to the human dimension. And this is a tradition that we should see to that it prevails. EU and OSCE should together work and systematically in order to investigate the human rights violations and see to that human rights violations get consequences. People that commit violations as has been done in Belarus should be taken to court and be put and be responsible for the actions. And therefore, it is extremely important that, as the Belarusian civil society does, that those cases are well documented, and that we can, when the time is right and the time is ripe, that we can put those responsibility to some sort of trial. The Lukashenko regime is basically a dead, I would say, dead duck. It's out of order. It won't work. The protest has been so strong. There are so many people taken to the streets and on strikes that even though they are taking measures for counter-offensive, that will not work in the long run. I think there are many signs that we can see that say that the days of the Lukashenko regime is counted. The big issue is what happens then. Will there be enough space for those democratic forces that are active today to form a new government? Or will there be a transition into another government in the gray zone between democracy and dictatorship? I think that EU and OSCE in this respect can be quite helpful in order to safeguard the legitimacy of those people who have been so courageous and so brave the last month, taking the streets to in Minsk and other cities. And let's not forget that this is the protests that has been 100% free of violence. It has been peaceful process. They have been extremely broad anchored among the population, and it has had enormously strong female participation. All these factors is making Belarus a potential role model for future fight for democracy and freedom in other countries. Thank you.
For your very deep analysis, and I would come back to the question of the OSCE. As you said, the Swedish chairmanship should reject all attempts of Russia to get more influence on Belarus. Valery, what would you think? I mean, how could that dialogue moderated by the OSCE in Belarus look like? Is this really something that could happen? Because Russia, as we all know, and it has been said a couple of times, is very closely following what is happening in Belarus. What do you think?
And thank you very much for excellent remarks from both Kent and Olaf. Really appreciate your insights, reflections, and recommendations. I will briefly stop on Russia issue in general because it is so central to the situation in Belarus. We understand that the most important for Belarus and the prospects of the change in Belarus is the protest, what people think, how they act, how they see the situation, if they find the prospects of keeping Lukashenko in power acceptable. They seem to be not, but nevertheless, there's also Russia that has been supportive of Lukashenko for decades. It's because of Russia that Lukashenko has been sort of such a successful political figure. He has always been able to rely on their support, on their understanding, and he's been their ally as well. But interestingly, one of the features of the protest that it has never been geopolitical. Since the voting day, there was no anti-Russian sentiment, or there was no pro-European sentiment, pro-EU or pro-US. It doesn't matter. Like, people did not speak about geopolitical factors at all. It was only focused on the domestic agenda, on the political agenda. First, it was about people's desire for free and fair elections. And then, because of this crackdown, this enormous crackdown, it was about the need to stop the violence and to release political prisoners. So Russia stayed with Lukashenko since then. And unfortunately, it did not specify exactly, like, if it understands the protest well. It just stayed with Lukashenko. It seems to be a very reluctant figure at this point of time. It's sort of sitting on the fence a little bit. It is not completely in favor of Lukashenko, but it's just undecided, like what to do next, because the stakes are so high for Russia. They are afraid that if Lukashenko is gone, there's somebody, even though the protest was non-geopolitical, and nevertheless they're afraid that the next figure, the next authority would be anti-Russia and would undermine Russian interests in Belarus. At the same time, they should understand that their continued support for Lukashenko, who has crossed all the boundaries of authoritarian manner of governance, it turned into totalitarian regime now. They harm their own interests in Belarus. Belarusians are not anti-Russian in general. They are fairly friendly to Russia, and they're fairly okay with stronger relations with Russia, with the integration processes. They might be concerned about the issues of corruption, for example, or non-transparency, lack of transparency in dealings between Lukashenko and Putin. But at the same time, on the people-to-people level, Belarusians are fairly friendly to Russia. But not this time. Kind of people see that Lukashenko is being supported by Russia, and they reflect. It goes back to their perception of Russia as sort of a negative force in the protest. The protest is very broad, it's very popular, and people are concerned and are frustrated that Russia is not understanding the nature of the protest, that it is not anti-Russian, that it is anti-dictatorship. We understand, and Belarusians understand as well, that Russia has its legitimate interests in Belarus. It is normal. We have very close relations over centuries, and Russia has interest in economy, in political issues, in social sphere, issues related to the security sphere. This is fine. But what is unacceptable to Belarusians is that Russia can use this weakness of Lukashenko to strengthen the control over Belarus, that it can undermine the political, economic sovereignty of Belarus. It can use this situation as a pretext to step in and undermine our own independence. Another thing that a protest has become very important about is that Belarusians showed how much they value the independence of Belarus, how much they value their own country. They turned to national symbols like immediately after the voting day. Immediately they used national symbols sort of to visualize the protest, but also to underscore how much they appreciate their own country, that this country is independent and sovereign. Therefore, Russia should be very careful in assessing the situation on the ground. It tries sometimes to kind of paint it in sort of anti-Russian colors or pro-Western colors, but this is not the case. Either it willingly sort of misleads itself on the nature of it, or it doesn't understand the nature of the protest. But in any case, it does not bode well for Russia itself. It damages its interest in Belarus in the long term. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Olaf, would you like to react on this? And still the question later to you, Valery, how could the OSCE in that case, in the light of what you just said, moderate such a discussion within Belarus? But first, Olaf.
Yeah, actually, I did not say that there should be no Russian influence in Belarus. I think what is typical for the Helsinki Accord and the process afterwards, it's not that it is a common agreement between West and East. It is a common agreement. It was finalized in Helsinki when we still had the Soviet Union. And it was an expression of what I would call strategic patience from the Western European side and the Western side. Giving the opposition in Eastern Europe and Central Europe a space to work and to act, and they formed those Helsinki committees, etc. And after a while, we got all those liberating forces working within the societies. And we had a situation 1989 in Berlin, and we had in the 1991 in Soviet Union, which actually showed that it was possible to have democratization and transition processes by peaceful means. And what happens now in Belarus is a consequence of this development. And it is a consequence it is not geopolitical in an antagonistic sense, but it's actually a consequence of one of the most successful peace building process we have seen in the world or globally. And that is the process that took place and started in the early 70s in Helsinki. And so we should not see this in an antagonistic context. We should see this as a peace-building process in Europe and a peace-preserving process in Europe. And therefore, it's so important that we do not accept those proposals from Russia to address the security issues in Europe by creating spheres of influences. We should address the peace and security issues in Europe with the same measures as we have done since 1975, confirmed 1990 and confirmed 1999. And Belarus is a very, very interesting part of this. Not at least because the fact that those protests we now see are so peaceful, so broad, and so determined in order to build democracy. When democracy is there in Minsk, it should be the Belarusians and the Russians' task to form a new sort of companionship, a new sort of cooperation, based on the equal right for Belarus to make their own choice with and in all aspects. Actually, I think it will be wonderful if Russia and Belarus. I think that's obviously very natural that such cooperation will be established, but it must be based on the equal rights for Belarus to preserve their sovereignty.
Thank you. Valeria, what just has been said by Olaf, is that possible to build a transition process with the help of OSCE and Russia and Belarus on equal rights?
Thank you. I think it is very possible, and this is what we're calling for in the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, that OSCE should take a stronger stand. And of course, OSCE is as good as the members of the organization want it. It can be as effective as the members, be it Sweden, Albania, or the United States or France. If they want this to succeed, it will succeed. Or if Russia decides to undermine the process, which is very intricate, very subtle in the OSCE, it is very easy to undermine it, of course. But OSCE is uniquely placed, both in terms of the values and mechanisms, the outreach, the standing in the OSCE area, to be an effective instrument, to be an effective mechanism and platform for such discussion. And here in the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, would definitely welcome participation of Russia in this concert of nations that have special standing and special interest and champions of free and democratic Belarus. Yes, we would definitely welcome such development, and we still believe that Russia can be this constructive player in resolving the situation, this crisis in Belarus. It would take them to realize what's going on, to be honest in assessment of the situation, that this is about the aspirations of Belarusians. They have changed a lot, or rather, I would say that the Belarusians have discovered what has always been in them. Their aspiration to live in a democratic country, their belonging to the European civilization, their reliance on values and principles of democratic societies. Now this time has come that Belarusians have turned to these principles. They want to follow them. They want to use them. They want to live using these values and principles. And Russia should be honest in assessing this and understanding this, that the point of no return has passed, and Belarusians don't want status quo any longer. They don't want pre-August 9 situation anymore. And they will not give up on this unless Belarus is turned into a concentration camp. And we can see that Lukashenko is moving in this direction. But nevertheless, answering to the basic question is that, yes, we see the role of the OSCE, constructive role of the OSCE in resolving this crisis in Belarus. But it depends on the will and genuine approach of the members of the organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Kent, how would you comment what Valerie just said? Is it possible to have this moderation, the transition process monitored by OSCE, and also elections next year monitored by the OSCE?
Let me make three remarks. First, I want to say that Belarus, unfortunately, have taken several steps away from OSCE the last year. It started with a too late invitation to OSCE ODIHR to monitor the elections. And that was, of course, very bad, even if they were finger pointing back at OSCE. It was definitely a mistake by their side not to invite in time, so that the OSCE could consider sending ODIHR to monitor the elections. They have not answered on the letter by the two Troika members, and thirdly, they have refused to participate in the Moscow mechanism. So when we talk about OSCE's ability to interact with Belarus, it still remains to be seen, because when I have, on behalf of the incoming chairmanship, had communications with them, they make it extremely complicated, and it will not at all be an easy task to establish that kind of contact. But we will, of course, when we come into the chairmanship in January, remain confident that this will be a good way to move forward in the process. Secondly, we have to relate to realities. Lukashenko and the regime is continuing with the process with this constitutional reform and their plan, and are backed by Russia. But there's another reality which besides the sanctions, or partly because of the sanctions, but also COVID-19 situation and more, is putting pressure on the economic situation in Belarus. And I think that will be a very important factor to make Belarus move in the coming year, because the situation with less and less ability to run the country because of a bad economy, that will be an important factor. When we are looking to the coming year, I think something will happen of the reasons that I mentioned, probably in the spring. The pressure continues, the uprising continues, the economic situation is deteriorating, and COVID-19 is continuing. And I don't think that vaccines will make a big entry to the big group of people in Belarus soon. So I think the pressure will be on the regime to engage in some kind of dialogue, and I see the opportunities in the spring. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think as there are no questions so far anymore in the chat, I think we could come to an end, because it has been said a lot about what could happen next year, what the OSCE could do, and also what European Union could further do. I would like to ask our three speakers for a short final remark. How you would see Belarus? How you would like to see Belarus next year, and how do you think it might move into what direction next year? Would you, Valerie, please start?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for arranging this discussion. It's important to continue talking about the situation, and I very much appreciate the remarks and the insights of my co-speakers. I would like to point at one observation about the protest, about the situation in Belarus these days. That for a very long time, Western countries, Western democracies were the champions of democratic transition in Belarus, while the society in Belarus was not fully ready. It has not, it did not display its willingness to stand up for democratic process, for democratic transition. In those elections in 2001, in 2006, in 2010, in 2015, when we had presidential elections or referenda between them, you could see that there was a crackdown, and then there would be a reaction. Then democratic countries would call for action and would introduce sanctions even against Lukashenko and his people. But in such situations, you could see like, well, it means more for the Western countries than for Belarusians themselves, but not this time around. This time, it is very different. It is Belarusians who lead the process. They are the champions of the change in their own country. And Western countries are in a position, in a supporting role, essentially. You have a chance to support us right now. You have a chance to support a genuine desire to change the democratic for free and democratic Belarus. This is not about you sort of being responsible for the change. It's your support. It's your moral, organizational support to help us lead this process. And even now, when we speak in the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, when we speak about the sanctions or the measures in response to the situation on the ground, we speak about the measures to stop the violence, to stop the lawlessness in Belarus, to create basic conditions for political dialogue, something that would bring us to the elections that would be free and fair and recognized by the international community. And of course, OSCE ODIHR would be the most central organization for this because of its expertise, because of its reputation. But again, this is about Belarus leading the process. But at the same time, Western democracies, OSCE in particular, have the chance to prevent it from happening, from developing in a very negative scenario when Lukashenko prevails and just shuts down, and the whole protest would collapse and turn into a concentration camp.
Olaf, your final remark, please. Could you please unmute? Yeah. I mean, mute yourself.
I totally agree with what Valerie said. It's exactly the experience that I have had working with the Belarus opposition. And what is happening now is very much what we saw in Poland with Solidarność. We saw it in Czechoslovakia with Charta 77, and we have seen it all over the Eastern and Central Europe, that a transition in order to be successful must be based on a strong political and determined will among the population. And this is what we now see in Belarus. And this is makes it very much, make me very much more hopeful than I would have been 5 years ago, for example. In my view, it's up to us in the EU or in other OSCE countries to be supported and to show that we really want this to happen, and that we are prepared to take necessary measures in order to support the change. But the change must come from the Belarusian people themselves. That is the lesson we have learned in Europe since 1975, and very much so since 1989.
Thank you. Kent, may I ask you for your final remark, please?
So a few reflections. I think it's very important that we try to avoid and watch out for games here and look for a genuine way forward. This process now concerning the constitutional reform reminds me of a meeting I had with Lukashenko in December 2015, where he promised that he would move on with the constitutional reform in the spring of 2016, and that was supposed to be voted in the Belarusian parliament in June 2016. Of that, we all know that it started, and the work was going on in the beginning of 2016, and then the constitutional reform just disappeared. Now, 5 years later, we are there again. It's time for a new process, as they call it, for a new constitutional reform. I'm just saying that we have heard many of these things before, and that it's important that we are very observant on what is a sincere and true process. Secondly, when it comes to Lukashenko himself, it's of course very crucial, the question of his own mindset. I think that maybe that kind of realism that have arrived in him and with him and his people around him might also be a possibility for a kind of peaceful engagement of OSCE, which I definitely hope we could have, hopefully in the spring, because I think next year will be the year where OSCE is the option. So I think that we have a heavy expectation on us, but we have to do it together with other friends in OSCE and the support of others in OSCE. But maybe we will have to deal with maybe a regime that at least have arrived to some kind of realism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your excellent contributions and very interesting discussion. As we said, the whole panel, as the whole discussion from today has been recorded. So we will later send a link as soon as it has been done to, so you can watch it again, and you can also spread it among people who are interested in that theme and are also committed, as you are, to Belarus and EU's leadership role in this region. Yeah, thank you again. We, together with the Atlantic Council, will keep this topic high on the agenda next year as well. And now I would like to thank you again for today's discussion, and Merry Christmas.